Now, I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker. Neva Ahmed is a marketer and a virtual speaker who draws on her journalism experience to develop content for tech companies. As a content editor with Prezi, her dedication to creating compelling content is what led to this role, where she was the first hire on their editorial team, focused on supporting the business audience. Now, Neva's passion for storytelling stems from her roles in the newsroom and in content marketing, which informs her keynotes about how incorporating stories and storytelling principles can be used to create stronger presentations. Now, Neva has shared her keynotes at nonprofit organizations and enterprise tech companies alike, including Cisco. So Neva, I was really excited to connect with you prior to today's session. Is there anything else that you want our audience to know about you before we give the stage to you?
Thank you so much for the intro, Meg. I think you covered it all. I'm just really happy to be here, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to yield the stage to you. Just as a reminder to our audience, if you have questions for Neva, please feel free to put them into the chat. I'll be soliciting more questions in the chat as well. So please feel free to ask whatever you'd like, and we will hopefully, we'll get to as many questions as we can once the presentation concludes. So Neva, floor is yours.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Meg. So I used to work as a journalist a few years back, and during that time I was covering protests, strikes, and town halls. But I will always remember the story of this one man. Imagine if this was your life. You're living in a war-torn communist state where drugs are easily accessible, but food can be hard to come by. And for Moody Thier and I, it was. Born and raised in Burma, Moody started his career as a teacher. This was just the type of person Moody was. His life was based around how he could help others despite any obstacles that were thrown his way. However, in 1990, he was imprisoned for using and selling opium. This still didn't stop Moody from helping those in need. Despite having no medical experience, Moody became the doctor to 500 inmates. After his time in prison and relatively no change with the government, it got to a point where Moody really needed to get out of Burma. So he escaped to northern Thailand and joined his wife. And still, his time helping others did not come to an end. Now he's settled in Thailand, where he runs a dormitory in Wai Nam Pun for children who are affected by drugs and poverty, just as he had been. And on top of that, Moody is running this dormitory and supporting these children, all while being 90% blind. Not only is Moody's story powerful in sharing perspectives of those around the world, but it also highlights that it's not just about the destination or the resolution of the story, but about the journey itself, so we can see all the obstacles that Moody had to overcome. This is exactly what makes presentations great. The narrative or the story is what allows us to connect with our audience and maintain their attention throughout. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Neva Ahmed, and I'm a content editor at Prezi. I'm so excited to be sharing the importance of storytelling and how you can apply these principles beyond the presentation. Meg already gave a great introduction, but I just wanted to share a little bit more about myself. As I mentioned, my name is Neva, and I work at Prezi, which is a virtual collaboration software that allows you to have the most engaging, interactive, and professional-looking way to present over video. And that's actually the software I'm using right now. So at Prezi, I work closely with influencers and thought leaders to help them create and record compelling Prezi video content that we then share with all our users. And I would love to connect with all of you and keep this conversation going. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And if you have any additional tips that I don't mention during the session, please let me know. I'm always trying to learn more. So with that, let's dive right in. Prior to Prezi, my previous experience had been in reporting and marketing, where I'd seen how effective stories are for presenting and sharing information. And in both of those roles, I've had to give my fair share of presentations. And now, I'll admit, I'm someone who typically shies away from leading a meeting or presenting in general. So I realized that I needed to change my approach to public speaking in order for me to feel a little more comfortable. And so I pulled from what I really like to do, share stories. And so what's worked for me is to frame my content, whether it be in a meeting or if I'm presenting like this, as a story in order to feel just a little less intimidated. With that in mind, we're going to be covering 5 areas in today's session: why storytelling is important, how to format your presentation on a story structure, 3 elements of storytelling, 5 common storytelling mistakes that we want to avoid, and how to apply all these principles beyond a presentation so we can have more productive and engaging meetings. Plus, I'm going to be sharing a summary and some resources for all of you at the end of the session, so stay tuned. Let's kick it off with the importance of storytelling. When you're creating your presentation, you want to think of stories as examples and evidence that are going to be used to make your point. Storytelling is especially important because it allows us to be more relatable and connect with our audience. Elena Valentine, the CEO of Skill Scout Films, sums this up perfectly in this short clip, sharing how our brains are hardwired to consume stories.
Neva, it looks like we might have lost your audio. Just as a highlight here, I'm waiting to see if we have questions in the chat, but if anybody else is having issues hearing, let me know, please.
Neuroscientist Yuri Hassan supports Elena's point through a number of studies he conducted in a lab at Princeton. He concludes that storytelling causes the neurons of an audience to sync with the storyteller or presenter's brain. Therefore, you're more likely to respond to the story with the same emotions that the storyteller or presenter had when they experienced it. Given the power storytelling can have on your audience, the next step is understanding how to best wield it and integrate it throughout your presentation. What I like to do is think of the presentation as a narrative in itself and structure my presentation on a typical hero's journey. There's a common misconception that our stories need to be completely new, when in reality, we like stories the most when we understand the structure and know where it's going. By following the hero story structure, you will take your audience on a journey, like what I shared in my story with Moody and also with Amy Purdy, who gave a TED Talk about how she lost both her legs to meningitis, but then relearned how to snowboard to continue her professional career. Now, if we compare the hero's journey structure with Amy's TED Talk, we can see exactly how it plays out. The hero journey structure tells us to start with all the background information and introduce your hero or your key message. In Amy's TED Talk, she applies this by providing us with information on her childhood. She shares that she grew up in a desert town and that while she was growing up, she always wished to live in a place where it snowed, and at age 19, she finally did. The story progresses as we move into the rising action stage. The structure tells us that the rising action is going to be used to highlight the main problem that the hero will face and ultimately have to overcome. Amy shares that one day she got the flu and was in the hospital on life support with bacterial meningitis, which led to her losing both of her legs. At this point, the audience is going to be unsure of the hero's fate, which continues to reel them in. We know the story is going to end well, but we're still intrigued to know, how is Amy going to resolve this? So Amy decides to get back on her snowboard, but not without a lot of difficulties, especially when it comes to the type of prosthetic leg she wants. We continue to see Amy in a state where she's trying to overcome something. As we move into the falling action stage, we begin to see progress on our hero's problem, but it's still not fully resolved quite yet. For Amy, she's struggling to choose a prosthetic leg, so she takes matters into her own hands. Instead of trying to make a leg match her, she creates legs for herself. With her new legs, she goes back to school and starts snowboarding again. Finally, we come to the resolution. As the name implies, we're at the point where we are wrapping up the story. We're showing how our character has overcome the problem that they started out with. Since Amy began snowboarding again with her newly designed legs, she has won 2 back-to-back World Cup medals. While your story does not need to end with you winning a gold medal, you want your audience to be just as excited about your conclusion as they were throughout your entire presentation, which can be achieved by following the structure of a story. But your presentation will only be as good as the story that you're sharing. So with that, let's discuss the 3 storytelling elements you need to incorporate into all your stories: creativity, authenticity, and relevance, which I like to think of for easy reference as CAR. So let's dive into how CAR, creativity, authenticity, and relevance can be used to strengthen your presentations. Creativity plays a huge role in your presentation, but what many people forget is that you don't need to be a master designer in order to be creative. How you deliver and present your story can be incredibly impactful in keeping your audience interested and engaged. For one of his TED Talks, author Tim Urban uses stick figures and a monkey in order to explain procrastination. While a well-designed presentation can play a role in how your audience consumes the information, It's not the most important factor. As long as your presentation is used to supplement your story and complement your delivery, you don't need to have all the bells and whistles. I do want to point out, though, that while this shows that you don't need to be an expert designer to create your presentation, visuals can still have an impact. So my pro tip is that the easiest way to prevent your audience's eyes from glazing over is to incorporate some sort of visual content that you can at least interact with, whether it's a few images, some stick figures like Tim did, or even some short bullets. I've already touched a bit on the importance of authenticity, as stories allow space for human connection and emotion. But personal experiences can really help take your storytelling to the next level. It can take a lot of courage to share personal stories, but it will give you a lot of credibility. In a commencement speech at UC Berkeley in 2016, Sheryl Sandberg shared for the very first time how she felt on the one-year anniversary of her husband's death. She built up credibility and trust by confiding in the audience, which also allowed her as a presenter to feel more connected to them. While this element requires the most courage, it can also generate the biggest reward. Of course, you want your story to be relevant to what your presentation is about, but it's also useful because it gives you room to reference your story throughout your presentation. In Amy's TED Talk, she continuously brought up how she wanted to become a professional snowboarder, which motivated her to keep working towards her goal. Having an overarching story or theme to constantly refer back to creates cohesion and maintains interest throughout the session. Another example is from Sean Anker, who starts off his presentation with a story about a unicorn from his childhood. Now, I'm not going to spoil his entire TED Talk, but as he moves through it, he references how he uses the same process of convincing his sister that she was a unicorn to reframe his thinking at work. One of my favorite stories that incorporates all these elements is from my manager, Lorraine, who talks about her journey into public speaking. She talks about how she was a ball of nerves at even the thought of public speaking, but after putting herself out there and continuing to practice more, she now has regular speaking gigs and has been named a top virtual keynote speaker. In her story, she incorporates these three elements. For creativity, you can see she uses simple cutout designs and GIFs to allow us to visualize and follow along with her as she prepares to go to the Empire State Building for this speaking gig. She's also being very vulnerable with the audience by sharing this personal story. And lastly, she's incorporating relevance because at one point or another, most people have felt a level of uncertainty and nervousness before public speaking. Now that we've covered CAR, you can see that these elements work best together, and weaving them into your story will generate a very attentive audience. With that in mind, let's talk about some storytelling mistakes that you should avoid. Nick Morgan, a Harvard lecturer, communications expert, and author, has shared 5 storytelling mistakes he's seen, especially when it comes to presentations and speeches, which are lack of interest, too much information, not being deep enough, hiding your failures, and losing sight of the most important things. So let's dive into each of these and learn how we can overcome them. First off, speakers will try to include some sort of shock value, which can actually end up having an adverse effect and make your audience lose interest. We think we need to include shocker after shocker in order to maintain their interest and engagement. But this can end up confusing your audience so much because there's so many changes that it's hard for them to follow. What Nick suggests instead is to signal where you're headed with your presentation so that your audience can have the pleasure of anticipating it and following you on your journey. Another thing to note is that a human's attention span is only 8 seconds, which is even less than a goldfish, which means we need to hook our audience immediately or we've lost them. I mentioned earlier that one of the elements of storytelling is being authentic. However, sometimes we can end up oversharing when attempting to do so. When determining how much detail you want to go into, Nick recommends asking yourself, what information is absolutely necessary to include? What you can do to help you determine this is to have all the details, information, data, everything that you want laid out, and then go through that and try to make a light version with only the highlights. Because when you're sharing a story, you're not going to be sharing every little detail. You're only going to be sharing the details that will have the most impact on your story. So for example, if someone is sharing data in a meeting, we don't want to see their entire spreadsheet with all the raw numbers. If we're overwhelmed by this data, we're just going to end up tuning it out. Instead, we want to be providing them with the key metrics and data that's most important and relevant to our attendees. Next, we need to consider if we're providing content that intrigues people so that they want to come back to it. The storytelling paradox tells us that if you write and deliver great stories, people won't be able to get enough of it. There are certain shows like Squid Game and Emily in Paris, and most recently Bridgerton, that are so bingeable that all we want to do is have the next season come out so we can watch the entire thing. Also, feel free to share any of your binge-worthy shows in the chat. I need to add some more to my queue. But what we need to do is take into consideration the emotions we're making our audience feel and intertwine their lives into the story. We want to make them feel for the characters, wonder about the next step in the journey, and speculate on what could come next, which is what we saw when we were sharing the story of Amy and Moody. The next thing is that by only highlighting your achievements and not the journey that you took to get there, you're actually hiding your failures. And this can have a negative effect for speakers because it can make them come across as disengaging and disingenuous. So what we really care about as attendees is how they failed, and especially how they kept going when they did, because that is what makes one truly authentic. Again, if we look back at Amy's talk, we talked about how she faced all these obstacles, but the whole time we knew that she was going to persevere at the end, but we still wanted to see the journey that she took to get there. We also discussed that as a speaker, you need to go deep, and that plays out in more ways than just making your content bingeable. It also means that we need to reveal the most important parts of the character and show them at their best and their worst through their ups and their downs. We want to see them at moments of extreme struggle, failure, and uncertainty. And this also ties into, incorporating that trust with your audience and making yourself feel truly authentic. These are the embarrassing moments that we actually tend to instinctively shy away from, but these are the ones that the rest of us really want to hear about. For example, we see this played out through influencers, human or not, on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. We want to see the challenges they face and their daily struggles in order for us to connect with them a little more. Now that we're armed with what to avoid when it comes to storytelling, let's move into our next section, how to apply all of these principles beyond the presentation. Because stories shouldn't be reserved for just formal presentations or TED Talks. All the principles I've discussed today can be applied to your daily meetings, sales calls, product demos, and much more, because we want our audience, no matter how small they are, to be engaged with our presentation. But first, let me set the scene. Most virtual presentations, whether it's events, webinars, or meetings, currently look like this, where speakers are really tiny and they have to screen share and their slide deck takes over the whole screen. And because of that, most people are experiencing video conference fatigue, and they are so tired. They're tired of seeing the same slides over and over again. And as this fatigue has descended upon the workforce, we've seen that meeting over video is just not quite the same as meeting face-to-face. Our brains have to work a lot harder to pick up on these nonverbal cues, and most attendees tend to have their mics turned off because they're trying to just decrease background noise. But as a result, you can sometimes feel like you're just speaking into a void. You can also always see yourself staring back at you, which can make you more self-aware than you'd be if you're in person. Therefore, it's really important to overcome this by making your meetings more interactive and engaging by, you guessed it, weaving a story into it. Shivani Berry, CEO and founder of women's leadership program Ascend, shared a LinkedIn post recently outlining how to get your team to support and get invested in your ideas, which can also be applied for things like job interviews and just career growth in general. She recommends using stories to get people to trust your ideas and what you're talking about through her AIM framework: audience, intent, and message. So with the audience, you want to understand what your audience really cares about and what exactly do they want to know. Intent will be all about how you structure your story, and message will be what's the key message that you're trying to share. So let's say if this were an interview, here's how you could implement this framework. You know that your audience comprises of the interviewer and the team you're hoping to join. And what they care about the most is how you can be a strong asset to their company. So that's something you want to keep in mind. For intent, you want to structure it around what you plan to bring to the company and share your experiences in your story. And for the message, you're going to be focusing on addressing this one question: how will my experiences and stories that I'm sharing show I'm a strong asset to this company? Another example I have is from presentation expert and speaker Rich Mulholland, who shares how he integrates the hero's journey into every sales presentation and prospect meeting. The hero, who he refers to as the dragon hunter, must wield a weapon to defeat a dragon and retrieve the treasure. In a sales meeting context, the customer is the hero, the dragon is the problem in the world that your company can uniquely solve, and the treasure is the opportunity that exists if they do. By uncovering your client's problem, you can naturally walk them through the story of your business, which humanizes your product while highlighting how it can be a solution. Reflecting back on what we know about the hero's journey and how we have seen it played out through the dragon, we see that Moody and Amy were both working to solve a problem. Moody to escape Burma and live a better life, Amy to take back her professional snowboarding career. Had we not known the trials and the steps that they took to get there, we would not have resonated with these stories as much, and they wouldn't have been as impactful. Which is why we need to recognize how storytelling is so impactful, because it allows us to connect more with our audiences, that the hero's journey provides an effective structure for your presentation, that the 3 elements of storytelling, CAR, creativity, authenticity, and relevance, are key for any presentation, that the 5 storytelling mistakes, lack of interest, too much information, not being deep enough, hiding your failures, and losing sight of the most important things are critical to keep in mind. And finally, that by using the structure and elements above, you can craft stories to be used beyond a keynote for virtual meetings or calls that are sure to keep your attendees interested. With the shift to hybrid work and virtual meetings, we're always on camera, and stories have really enabled me to feel more comfortable. So the next time you're working on a presentation, think about how you can incorporate a story into it to keep your audience engaged, connect on a deeper level with them, and make the experience more enjoyable overall. And I see that my sound did not come through for the video, so I apologize for that. But what I've gone through is exactly what Elena Valentine had shared in her video. She was talking about how these stories allow us to connect with our audience, to feel truly vulnerable with them, and have a better experience overall. So thank you all so much. Before I close out, I want to share a few resources with you. If you like Prezi Video and want to try it out for yourself, you can review our quick start guide here, which shares the 3 options for getting started. And it also shows how you can get a 1-month free upgrade. So I recommend you check that out. And you can also review our Prezi tutorial library for videos on how to get started. So I just want to say thank you all so much for joining me today. And I really hope that you find these tips helpful. And I'm also open to always hearing new tips. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And on that note, I'm going to pass it back over to Meg. Thank you so much for calling that out in the chat. But yeah, looking forward to diving into the Q&A.
No worries. I'm glad that that a bunch of people also said they were having the issue, because I was worried it was just me.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, we will. Thank you so much for detailing that out. We will absolutely make sure we get that fixed for the recording once we post that. Okay, so Nova has given us some amazing tips and tricks here, and I want to make sure that in the last 5 minutes we hold space in case anybody wants to ask questions. So if you have a question for Nava, please feel free to share it in that chat. It's on the right-hand side of the screen in front of you. And I'll be hanging out there so we can pull in any questions that we see that are, we can pass to Neva. I had I won't say personal question, but something that like I was curious about when I was listening to you. When you first started kind of implementing this idea of using storytelling in your professional life, how long did it take you from developing your first story of like, okay, this is what I'm going to start with, to getting to like realizing, okay, maybe I need a different story here, or maybe, what was that like when you first started? Because I think for a lot of people, if you don't already use some aspect of this, it can seem kind of like a huge shift to try and make if you're not a storytelling kind of person.
Yeah, great question. And, I will say I did struggle with this a little bit. It took me some time. One way that I'll use my presentation, for example, because, this story to share this did not just come out of the blue. I actually did Shine Boot Camp, which is like an accelerator program to help you with speaking. And one of the tips they recommended was basically outlining one side, like kind of doing a Venn diagram. One side was like everything that you're interested in, you have knowledge about, you just enjoy. And then the other thing was like all the professional skills that you have in life. And so in doing that, then you can kind of see the 2 things that, you enjoy and that you also do in your career. And I think by finding that balance, I was able to see, okay, like I enjoy telling stories. And then in using that, I think that that's just a beneficial tool for everyone to kind of say like, okay, how can I pull in elements of, maybe not necessarily like very personal elements, but things that they enjoy. How can I bring that into my professional career and use that to shape how you're telling these stories in meetings? Because I know, if it's meetings about like data, or, you're giving a super like technical presentation, you're like, how am I going to tell a story around this? But what I encourage you to do is, kind of pull in things that you enjoy doing, and that can kind of like help share your story. Maybe it's even like, okay, like, we totally failed. Like, you start off your presentation with that, like, have a funny story about like, okay, we had a really rough start, but here we are, like, kind of like ease the tension a little bit, make yourself more comfortable as a speaker. People will maybe laugh at what you shared, and that will kind of help you find your story, and like always find a story for each of your meetings.
I love that. And actually, now that you're saying that, yeah, I actually do use storytelling a lot more often than I would have thought at first guess. Because you're right, it does, you're able to like reference past experiences people have had, or, finding some way to really bring it home for your audience, to the people you're talking to. We only have 2 minutes left, and I want to make sure we leave time for people to connect with you, but we did get a really great question in the chat. Cynthia had asked if you have any tips for weaving storytelling into facilitating difficult content. So we talked about things from like like if it's like a very technical talk, but let's say you're talking about something that's either like very sensitive subject or something that is not a pleasant thing for a lot of people to discuss. Would storytelling be a good tool to use there, or do you think it could undercut your message?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and a really important question. And I think there is a way that you can incorporate a story into it, without necessarily like making it like so in your face that it's a story. What I shared, kind of like just incorporating things like past experiences, that's something that you could bring in to, share like, okay, that this is either something that's personally happened to you, so that you can, allow that difficult conversation so that they can feel a little more comfortable. So I think there are ways to not necessarily, maybe follow the hero journey structure, but there's still ways to incorporate like little stories into it. And that can be used kind of as like I shared earlier, they're like the examples and evidence. So say you're having like a difficult conversation with someone, let's just say it's like HR related, maybe you have to talk to someone about their job performance, and that's not an easy subject for sure. But, if you share, especially if you share your own experiences, you're like, maybe I struggled with this. I know people have struggled with this before. And like, I'm here to help you. By bringing into those stories, it will really like alleviate any nerves they have, and nerves on your part too. Because yeah, like I said, not an easy conversation, but I think there are ways you can sprinkle it in without necessarily shaping your entire conversation in this form of a story.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Neva. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I know it was very compelling for our audience as well. Thank you. Thank you so much for hanging in there with us. Is there anything else you want to say before we move on to our next session?
I just want to say thank you so much to Power to Fly. Thank you so much, Meg, for being a great host. I've really appreciated being part of this community, and I'm so happy to have been here and speak to you all.